Hi everyone and welcome. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know where you're joining us from today. For this session, we're joined by Jon Cornejo, the campaigner and consultant at Charity So White, who will be talking about tackling racism in frontline services. Now, just before handing over to Jon, I just want to share a few house rules and pointers for today's session. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded to watch on demand at a later date. The slides and other resources will also be made available to you, so don't worry if you've missed anything. During the session, please ask questions in the Q&A section to address at the end of the presentation, and feel free to share any other comments, experiences, or top tips in the chat section. Finally, if you encounter any sound or image issues, please let us know in the chat and we'll do our very best to get the session back to normal as soon as we can. And without any further ado, very quickly, let me hand over to Jon. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. It's really good to meet you all. I will try, there's a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm going to try and get through the content relatively quickly, but I want to make plenty of space for Q&As. My name is Jon Cornejo. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm an organizer with Charity So White, and I'm also an anti-racism consultant aside from that. Today, I want to touch on quite a lot of things, and this is really an introductory session. It's a food for thought and something for you all to take away. I'm hoping to follow this up with a written piece following similar lines of this talk, so hopefully we'll have that alongside everything else. But today I want to start with just a very quick overview of what race is and what racism is, just to get us on the same page. I'm going to focus a lot of the session on tackling what is white supremacy and how it shows up in charities, specifically in charity services, and finish with some steps and prompts for you to think about, particularly within your charity services, in terms of how you can embed anti-racism and tackle racism within frontline services. A quick note, my background is more in campaigning, particularly within the human rights and international development sectors. I have, as a consultant, worked with quite a few charities that run services. A lot of that experience is within the refugee sector, so there will be a little bit of bias with some of the stories I tell. But I do think a lot of this is very widely applicable, and it'd be really interesting just as we get into the Q&A and to the chat, just to hear a little bit about your experiences and how this resonates with you. But to kick off, again, this is a very sort of in a nutshell piece, but I want us to get us started in so we're all on the same page. Race and the sort of constructs of race, our understanding of race, white, black, and all of the different racial categories that we have at the current moment is a product of colonial exploitation and violence. It is deeply rooted in the colonial expansion of the 16th century and onwards. And that's something for us to bear in mind. Race and sort of constructs around identity have been very different throughout human history. So it's important to sort of see race as a relatively modern form of technology almost, of where these categories that we see ourselves in have been imposed on us in different ways and don't necessarily reflect our own identities and cultural experiences. Whiteness is really important to reiterate, was created as part of the political project of colonialism. It, as an identity, comes about really in the sort of early 1500s, where you start seeing colonial expansion, you start seeing colonial violence take place, the sort of so-called discoveries of the New World, and conversations happening about how to justify the resource extraction and exploitation of people that came with all of that. There were several different narratives. There was the kind of religious narrative in terms of spreading faith and tackling sort of supposed barbarity in different parts of the world. But whiteness as an identity comes about as a way for those elites within Europe, across Europe, to build an identity that's exclusionary and focuses on bringing people on their side. So that the working classes and people that were being exploited throughout the UK and Europe align with those elites and sort of excusing colonialism in that way. So supremacy is very much at the heart of whiteness as a project. And with that in mind, it's important to note that racial power dynamics and identities operate very differently around different parts of the world, are informed by very different histories. Africa as a continent is one of the most ethnically diverse places in the world. But depending on whether you have grown up or know much about Africa, it would be different how sort of you consider that, and the different sort of racial power dynamics are at play around different parts of the world. And especially when I've been working with the refugee sector, that comes into play where um, refugees from different parts of the world would have different ideas of what racism is, and there will be a certain role for charity services in that space to help refugees navigate the racialization that's happening to them, where they are now seen in a very different way, and their sort of position within a power structure has shifted and changed dramatically. But given all of that, and that racism works differently across different parts of the world, colonialism and the expansion of colonialism and capitalism throughout the world means that those European ideals about racial power dynamics play out around the world and impact everyone. So ideas of white supremacy, ideas of the supremacy of European culture, of European beauty standards, all of those things play a role in across societies around the world where racial power dynamics might work very differently for them, but there is still the notion that West is best and sort of a supremacy of European identities and countries and values. And again, just to think about whiteness and white supremacy, um, again, in this sort of conversation, I'm talking about whiteness as a political project, as a political identity. It's not necessarily something that you'll identify with yourself, and it's not necessarily something that speaks specifically to your own experiences. But whiteness is about exclusion. So in the same way as whiteness is a way of trying to create a pan-European identity where everyone kind of aligns with the political goals of colonialism, establishing that supremacy is at its core a process of excluding different kinds of people. So it's always about who is better and who is lesser. And that sort of categorization has changed and shifted over time, where we have seen different groups of people who have been previously not considered to be white and considered to be inferior in some way by these power structures, and now kind of brought into whiteness throughout different parts of history. And it's important as we go into the ins and outs of how racism operates within charity services and the world of the charity sector more broadly, that we really acknowledge that we exist in a world where those racial power structures impact us daily. And this isn't just something that people of color and racialized people in this room, in this space, and in our charities will feel, but also white people in the room. You will have been shaped by those racial power dynamics. You will have been impacted. Your experiences of the world around you, the ways that you have come to be at this position that you are in your organization, are shaped by those racial power dynamics. And it's something that we don't, I feel we don't acknowledge enough as a sector. And it's something that is really at the core of how we explore this conversation about racial power structures and white supremacy in the sector. And as part of that, we all play a role in upholding those systems of racial injustice, whether actively or against or without intention. There's all sorts of ways that we play a role in upholding those systems. And it can be just as simple as the sort of when you're recruiting someone and you see someone from a different background to you, and that kind of feeling that someone's not quite as good, or sort of the ideas around culture fit and who's going to be the right person to join this organization. A lot of these little small day-to-day actions play a role in shaping and upholding those systems of racial injustice. So it has to be quite an active, proactive approach that we take to tackling and dismantling those. And this is why really understanding racism and acknowledging racism exists has to be at the forefront of any work around anti-racism, and particularly when it comes to tackling racism within our organizations and within our services. And a note on white privilege, because I know that can be quite a contentious term and it can sort of spark some feelings of defensiveness in some people. White privilege doesn't mean that you do not struggle in different ways, especially with the world around us as it is, and the political landscape and the cost of living crisis and all of these different factors. It does not mean that you don't struggle with those things or with other things, but it does mean that those struggles don't stem from your race. So it's important to sort of really have that distinction within white privilege when we're having those conversations, and particularly to try and avoid the kind of defensive and emotional responses that we almost feel when we're having discussions around racism and white privilege. Sorry, my allergies are playing up some reason. Um, so far we've covered sort of what is racism, what is racism. There is many things that we can look into and resources that you can read and sort of educate yourselves on, but hopefully that gives you a good grounding in what the parameters of the conversation is. But now I want to talk about white supremacy specifically and use that as a focal point of how we explore the different ways that racism exists within services and how it looks. So I'm going to be using the framework of white supremacy culture. And this is specifically a paper and framework that was developed by Tema Akun, who is a US-based academic who was looking at the different ways that white supremacy shows up in the workplace. It's really important to note with here, particularly when you look at the paper itself, which I very highly recommend that you all do. It's actually really quite accessible. It is rooted in her experience as an academic within academia, her experiences as a Black woman in academia in the US. So some of the kind of frameworks and language and things that are being explored here are very specific to that sort of weird world of academia. But I do feel that a lot of these characteristics and frameworks do really help us understand and interrogate the different ways in which our workplace culture is built on white and Western European values and ideas of supremacy. This is really about the ways that we view professionalism, the kind of behaviors that we see as professional, and the kind of ways that we aim to sort of show up in the workplace, and what is seen as unprofessional as an outsider. And these different things are not bad things in and of themselves. So when I go through the slides and go through some of the specific characteristics, I'm not saying that you should stop doing these things completely, but it's about representing ways in which power functions in the workplace and thinking and sort of challenging yourself to dissect the ways that you are doing things and the ways that you are thinking. So this is the framework. I'm going to go through each of these with some examples of what these different characteristics of white supremacy culture are and what they mean in the workplace. And hopefully that'll give you more clarity, along with some examples specific to this charity services world. The source of this paper is at the bottom of the slides. It's whitesupremacyculture.info is Tema Akun's website. I would highly encourage you all to really take some time digging into this. It's a really wonderful resource. But do put questions in the chat, in the Q&A. I can't see the chat on the platform, but I can see your questions and I will come back and hopefully we'll have a good discussion. But different characteristics are fear, the idea that there is one right way of doing things, and a real sort of focus on like ensuring that everyone acts and does things in a particular way. Ideas around binary, sort of either or, we can do this or we can do that, but not necessarily space for nuance of all of the different things in the middle. Quantity over quality, more is more. We need to do more things, open up more services, deliver more outputs, and this constant drive to increase levels of productivity. Avoiding conflict, not liking conflict and kind of looking at avoiding it in different ways. A real culture of urgency, which I think is something that across our sector, and especially with the world around us being what it is something that we constantly feel that everything is really urgent and we have to keep doing things and we have to sort of not slow down to look at the bigger picture. Worship of the written word, so ideas that everything, it's not work if it's not written up into a document, if it's not put into a strategy, not necessarily valuing the sort of deep and intricate conversations that can happen in that process. Defensiveness, denialism, and sort of not taking critique as a good thing, and sort of being very defensive about it, and individualism and ideas of kind of individualism within the sector. As I said, I'm going to go through each of these and do ask questions in the chat as we go. But I'm going to start off with fear. So fear is a very broad term and sort of characteristics within Tamak Kuhn's work and within this framework. It's about how a culture of fear can exist within the workplace, and a fear around going against the existing power structures. So it's about the ways that the hierarchies and the power structures in our organizations hold themselves up and stand and stay as they are, through creating fear of going against it, of challenging a decision, of asking the wrong type of question. Staff can be quite afraid to speak up about their experiences, particularly within the idea about racism, not necessarily knowing how it's going to be taken, whether they're going to be heard, and potentially not speaking up, and maybe sort of keeping that to themselves or talking to other racialized people that they feel can relate to the experience and understand them. This sort of culture of fear creates an environment where it's really hard for staff to come together around similar experiences, and sort of really dig into these things. In my own sort of history, when I worked in Amnesty International, it was really, really hard to come together with other Black and brown colleagues and sort of start talking about the ways that racism was working within the organization. Because in the sort of area where everyone had lunch, when we would sit down together as a group of young Black and brown people, we would get judged. We would be told that we're being too loud. We would be told that it's not good for us to constantly sit together. We'd be called cliquey. And that environment really makes it really difficult for minoritized communities to come together and talk about these difficulties. And this quote in red is from some work that I did with an organization running services in the refugee sector specifically. And this was a young Black Muslim woman working within a refugee and asylum service. And it was just this notion that, like, I just have to put up with it and carry on. And she was aware of her experiences. She knew that this was coming. She knew that this was coming with the role in terms of the ways that she's interacting with different parts of the asylum system and the racism that can be very inherently built into that system. But just the notion that she just has to put up with it, it just comes with a job, and not even ever thinking about going to a manager and kind of exploring these experiences and these difficulties that she was having. So that's taking on a huge burden of experiencing racism on your own and not having the support structure because you just don't feel you're going to get it. The idea that there's one right way to do things in the workplace is something that I think can be quite common across lots of different organizations, whether that is processes that are explicitly laid out and really made very clear, or more often it's that there is a way to do things and it's not necessarily written down, it's not really expected of you. You expect staff to do things in a very particular way, to talk about things in a particular way. And there's sort of potential for punishment of staff that diverge and do things in a way that goes away from that sort of established right way of doing things. This is really also where ideas of culture fit and what a team player looks like can play into the situation. In recruitment, you see a lot of people talking about culture fit, about whether that's the right person, whether they're likely to be one of us, and that often talks about the kind of cultural background of a person and whether they feel someone will fit in with that group of people. But it also means that a team player is when a team player is seen as someone that does everything the ways that everyone else does it and the way that it's established. Within my career as a campaigner, I, for a very long time, was aware that there is a clear way of how you develop campaign strategies. There is an expected set of actions that you take. There's a specific approach that you take to developing an online action and sort of talking about campaign topics. And diverging from that or challenging or questioning that was always seen as a very bad thing. But it wasn't until I stepped away from that and I pushed myself to really go with my gut and really understand my critiques of these systems that I became a much better campaigner. And I think something that this sort of one right way approach can look like within the services space, a lack of diversity in leadership is something that exists across all of our organizations in the charity sector. We know this is a problem. There's been plenty of conversations and research around that lack of diversity. But because of the lack of diversity, can lead to a lack of experience or knowledge about racism and an assumption that racism doesn't happen in the workplace, it doesn't affect people. So you don't develop systems for reporting, you don't develop processes. And this is something that came up in quite a few clients within the services industry, of there just isn't any kind of reporting mechanisms because it's not something that's crossed the minds of the leaders that are developing those services. Either or, you'll see this a lot and realize that this happens a lot in our organizations, but framing things as binary choices. There is a choice of one thing or the other thing, but we can't do both, or we can't talk about all the complexities within those two options and around all of that. It strips away, it pushes us away from having complex conversations, nuanced conversations about the world around us. And the way I've seen this play out within the services, within charity services, is cases of discrimination or some incident happening to someone with multiple identities, and being able to, as a process and as managers, being able to look at sexism, for example, or racism, but not necessarily both. It comes back to the real sort of key point of intersectionality, where this either or approach and thinking, this binary way of looking at the world, can really hold us back from looking at the complexities of life and the complexities of how discrimination occurs. We're looking at more is more and this idea of quantity being the most important thing. You define success as being more, you're constantly looking for growth, and the idea of delivering more and more services to your clients, more clients, but not reflecting on the impact to your staff. Avoidance of conflict, managers trying to see both sides in disputes around conflicts and mediating incidents of racism, putting both people on the same level and not necessarily taking into account the differences. Urgency culture, oops. Urgency culture, everything is urgent. We need to do this thing, we need to respond to this crisis. I have to focus on this current crisis and have to ignore the things I've experienced. I can't take the time to really digest and acknowledge all of the different things that I've covered that have happened to me. And in defensiveness, defensive responses, I'm not racist, denial, this isn't racist, talking about things that didn't happen. That is something that can takes place a lot in disputes that I've been a part of. And individualism, sort of looking at individual acts of racism, sort of the idea of that I as a person, I am not racist, rather than I benefit from racial power structures. I exist within a wider system where racism exists and is real. And worship of the written word. There's lots I could talk about this, but often within services and within disputes and within instances of racism, you see this real trap where you have to prove that this person has been racist to you in some way, and really putting that onus on someone. And often, unless you have something written down somewhere, there's just no way of proving that to the tribunal or to the person investigating, and there's just no case to be found. we've covered a lot there, and I want to finish off just with some prompts for you all to think about how to tackle racism in frontline services. The most important one is to just really accept and acknowledge that systemic racism exists in our society. It's something that happens, and accepting it when you hear it from people. We don't want to go about questioning it and challenging it. Was this racist? Is this not racist? That's really important. Listen to the experiences of racialized staff, really take their experiences on board, really practice active listening so they're really aware that you are taking on board what they're saying and acting on their words. Making sure that the burden of proof that racism has happened is not put solely on the victims. We see this happen a lot across the whole charity sector, where the investigator is looking for that proof, and you, as the person that is the victim, have to prove that in some specific way. Build processes that examine the ways that systemic racism could have affected the incident. So if you start from that question that systemic racism is a fact of life, and there is potential for these things to have impacted here, look at that as a systemic problem rather than an interpersonal conflict, can really help you find the right approach. And normalize having difficult conversations about racism and oppression in the workplace. And the one thing I want you to take away is talk about race, talk about racism, really take the time to explore that with yourself and how that happens within your workplaces. I will leave it there and go to Q&A. Laura, if you could give me a hand with any questions there are.
No problem. Thank you so much. That was such an illuminating presentation. Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions in. So Laura has said, this is such an important and interesting topic. I'd love to hear some thoughts on practical ways that we can tackle this and any examples of organizations doing this well.
Good question. I don't necessarily have examples of organizations that are there, but there's plenty of organizations that are looking at improving and really having these conversations. I'm currently working with Refugee Action, where a lot of these things have come up, particularly given that service delivery staff are right on the front lines of the asylum system and are interacting with people where if you're a young Muslim woman who's a caseworker, you might face direct discrimination by the person from the Home Office, assuming that you're the refugee. Lots of different things happening, and it was really challenging for them to hear from their staff that, like, I'm experiencing these things every day and I just don't talk about it. I think the most practical thing is look at your processes. Essentially, I think as racialized people, I've certainly been there when things have happened to me. You look for processes, you look for systems. How can who do I raise this to? What is the way that this is going to work out? It can feel quite reassuring to know that there is a way of tackling something. It feels more real that I will be listened to if there's a specific process and policy around how to tackle racist incidents. And particularly within this kind of normalized state where we just assume racism is going to happen to us, taking the time as a manager to have your conversations with your staff and really make sure that everyone's aware that this isn't something that you're expected to deal with, and it's something that the organization will support you through, is a really powerful thing.
Thank you very much. And we've had another question. What's your advice when it comes to getting everyone on the same page about racism in a charity and becoming more proactive?
It's hard, and I'll start with that. But I think, honestly, the best piece of advice is just to have conversations with your teams. Particularly for managers, start off by educating yourselves. There is plenty of content out there. There are plenty of books and videos and all sorts of podcasts that you can listen to really take it all in. But in order to facilitate those conversations, you need to have conversations with yourself about how racism has impacted your life, the ways that white supremacy maybe has benefited you in different ways, the ways that the organization hasn't necessarily taken action on racism. and be really open about that and start those conversations with your teams. Have a team meeting where you're just really discussing not necessarily your individual experiences, because you don't want to put that pressure on someone to share the ways that people have been racist to them, but just about the ways that racism and white supremacy as systems have impacted their work, and leave some space to have really deep and difficult conversations about racist comments that you came across on a post on social media if you're working in that sort of area, or conversations you had with a client or with someone from another agency, and sort of being able to start opening up about those situations.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. It's such an
Mm,
interesting, insightful, and very, yeah, as I said, illuminating topic. Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for this afternoon.
yeah,
But thank you for joining us, John.
thank
And
you.
yeah, thank you to everyone else for joining us. It's been great. I think we're going to take a short break for lunch now, but join us at 2 p.m. for our next session. And yeah, thank you very much. Thanks again, John.
Thank you.